Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View From Afar podcast. And today we are joined as always by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan. And in this episode, Paul and I will analyse how the state of Israel has gone rogue, attacking United Nations peacekeepers in Southern Lebanon. At this juncture, it is clear that this is an intentional attack. Over the past week, Israel Defence Forces, that's the IDF, their troops have repeatedly attacked the United Nations peacekeepers authorised and deployed to the region by the United Nations Security Council. And this week, the government of Israel issued a statement the government of Israel issued a statement notifying the United Nations Security Secretary General that he was now banned from Israel and was basically persona non grata. Now, within a day of that statement being issued last week, the IDF troops had fired on UN peacekeeping positions in southern Lebanon. Several, if not four, were injured and a couple of them seriously. And despite the United States Biden administration cautioning Israel on its attacks on the United Nations personnel, overnight New Zealand time, the United States has agreed to deploy 100 US troops on the ground in Israel to operate missile defence systems. Now, in general terms, it would appear the Biden administration has allowed Israel's government to draw it further into a war or conflict that is justified by Israel on defence, but from outside analysis and assessments, including by those of the International Court of Justice, it is a defence that is clearly disproportional to Israel's threat. Now, atrocities in that respect continue to be levelled against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and it continues also with IDF hostilities in the occupied West Bank. There are missile attacks against civilian areas in Lebanon as Israel seeks out Hezbollah strongholds, and Israel fired missiles into Syria over the weekend. Now, it is clear that Israel is receiving missile attacks from its foes as well. But today, Paul and I will consider why Israel has begun to attack United Nations peacekeepers in the region. The other questions include, why has the United States deepened its involvement in Israel's so-called defence? And what of Hezbollah, Hamas, and others? Are their attacks on Israel a defence or an attacking offensive? And another question, what of Iran? And what is its position? And will it engage, if it needs to, in a full-scale war with Israel? And what are the consequences should it do so? So as you can see, there's a lot to unpack in this episode on this issue. But first, please do remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, feel free to comment, as we can include your comments and your questions in this program. And in that vein, we do encourage you to go across to YouTube to sign on as a subscriber to our channel And on that platform, the interaction is especially efficient. So with all that said and done, Paul is waiting for us to discuss these issues, and he's online right now. So let's cross to Paul and get this show on the road. Kia ora koutou, Paul. How are you doing there, Paul?
I'm doing very well, Selwyn. Kia ora to you and the audience, as usual. Took a little break last week because of school holidays in New Zealand, so took the boy down to a place called Lake Taupo with an active volcano down on the southern end, which was interesting for the kid. It was steaming, so it wasn't rumbling, but it was perking along, and yeah, it was good rest and recreation for all of us. But here we are, talking about Israel, and what I thought I'd do, if you'll indulge me a wee bit, I'd like to frame this. I've been thinking about this quite a bit, including during the holidays. And I'm trying to think of the decision-making logic at play, particularly in Israel, and then expand it out. And Sel and I, before the show began, I was mentioning the use of game theory to sort of think of how this is being played. I may or may not bring that back up in a few minutes, but let me frame it for the audience. And again, if people want to get in and disagree, by all means do so. But it works like this. I, of course, would love to be a fly on the wall in the Israeli high command because I'm not sure that what they started out to do vis-a-vis Hamas and Gaza is what they have wound up doing. That is, again, this has evolved mostly based on the response of others. So Israel is reacting to what I think are its enemy's weaknesses. It sees now an advantage. And so here's what I think is going on. And again, Selwyn, you're happy to correct me, and the audience as well. I think Netanyahu has decided to go for broke. The pager bombings, the muted response of the Iranians, he sees weakness. He sees that these adversaries are not as formidable as they were made out to be. Those pager bombs psychologically have done, ripple effect damage. The Iranian leadership are also checking their devices because Mossad has penetrated them. Again, Mossad killed the Hamas negotiator on the grounds of the command of the Revolutionary Guard. That's how deeply they can get in to the Iranian leadership. And so I think it's become very personal for them, as obviously as well as for Hezbollah's leadership, who are now missing two key figures thanks to missile strikes. So Netanyahu is going to go for broke. And in Israel, they talk about the sixth front war. Gaza, Hamas, Hezbollah, West Bank, Iran, the Houthis, and Syria.
That's a lot of fronts, Paul. That's a lot of fronts.
I know.
On a country which has a population of not much more than New Zealand, but a defence capability only because it is being propped up by its allies like the United States.
Exactly. What's really different is, you just said it, they have U.S. has boots on the ground, and they have this THAAD missile system, which is a high altitude interceptor. It catches the Iranian missiles at the apex of their flight. The THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Aerial Defense.
So it's a lot of. Sorry to jump in, but I just wanted to emphasise that's a lot of fronts, 6 fronts you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely, and he could well miscalculate. And I'll get to that in a second. And by the way, you mentioned the 100 boots connected to the THAAD. There's about 1,000 U.S. Army Rangers in theater. I believe they're in Jordan. And they're there for contingencies unknown at this point. But if they're there, the U.S. is anticipating that the war is going to expand and that Israel will need some help And so they've put these guys, they were supposedly sent to Israel, but reports are now they're no longer in Israel. That may not be true. Very likely they're in Jordan. The Jordanians would welcome them. But anyway, as you said, very, very adroitly, the U.S. is doubling down on its support for Israel. Now, let me get back to Netanyahu's decision making, because actually the most decisive factor in the escalation of this war are the U.S. elections. What Netanyahu is doing is he's making his move now before the election occurs. Why? He wants to present a fait accompli, a done deal, where he's going to carve out a 20-kilometer buffer zone in southern Lebanon. He's going to put his troops in there as an occupying force, and then he presents that to whoever wins the presidency. If Trump wins, Trump will give him carte blanche, and he'll run amok. But Harris is a different, and for him, an unknown quantity. Sure.
It's the unknown elements of her policy. And just remind people that when she first became the candidate for the Democratic pitch for the White House, she said she would not be silenced on this issue. Since then, she has been relatively silent or muted. And it seems that there are consequences for her on whether or not African, Islamic and Arab Americans will turn out to vote in her favour at all in the elections coming up only a matter of weeks away. So I agree with you 100% and underscore the fact that we're in a situation where clearly the presidency is in a lame duck situation, and the unknown factors are what is being played to the advantage by the Israelis as they move to abandon any constraints of international law, abandon any conventions, and even attack United Nations peacekeepers who are there as spotters, if you like, observers at the behest of the United Nations Security Council, of which the United States approved that deployment all those years ago in that region. So just that there for some of the context of where Paul and I are both coming from.
Yeah. So basically, the U.S. election has precipitated Netanyahu's move, and he's a wily SOB because she can't do much, as you just said, before the election. If she wins, there will be modifications to the U.S. policy towards Israel. She needs to, retain the Arab American vote, the Muslim American vote, which she's bleeding right now. And again, Trump will give Netanyahu as much rope as he needs. Although you told me in a private correspondence that maybe his isolationism will kick in. And he'll start saying, well, we don't want any more involvement. Biden got us put these troops into Israel. We don't want that. Could happen.
Well, he's a transactional individual, so he'll be wanting to see what he gets out of all of this carnage. And if he's getting nothing out of it, not the United States, but Trump himself, if he's in the presidency. And if there's no advantage, isolationism is his default position, right?
It is. And very, very good point. In fact, you could argue, and I think you said this in our correspondence, is, not only what does the United States get out of this, particularly over the medium to long term, but what exactly does Israel get out of this?
Yeah, this was my big point. We to and froed on this, didn't we?
Yeah,
I'll leave you to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth talking about. But to conclude this bit about Netanyahu's logic, he has no time for the UN. I mean, Israel has shown that because it gets criticized so much in the UN, it really doesn't have any regard for the UN whatsoever. And even though I think it's called the Infil or UNFIL mission in Lebanon has been around for 25 years, and by the way, includes 50 New Zealand defense personnel are on the ground in southern Lebanon.
And a significant amount of Fijians and those that factor very strongly.
Fijians, Tongans are all part of these Blue Helmet missions. They're now at grave risk because the Israelis told the UN to pull them out because they're inside that 20-kilometer buffer zone. and said, get them out of the way. They used the excuse that Hezbollah operatives are in the vicinity of the outposts. But now they're taking direct fire from the Israelis. It's very one-sided. Hezbollah is not firing at the UN troops. And if I was the head of the head of the infill mission, if I got that correct, I would pull them out because someone's going to die. I don't think they're serving any purpose anymore. They were pretty toothless, very toothless anyway. And let's reveal.
But just on that, why are they toothless? We have to appreciate the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. And that within a conflict zone like this, there would be those that argue that peacemaking protocols ought to be brought in by an international body like the United Nations Security Council authorisations. But the problem is that the problem with the veto and et cetera, prevents any kind of armed response. And I suppose what we can think about in those contexts is the UN forces in Korea fighting all of those years ago. And also from the point of view of the Balkan states, I should say. And, you know, the right to protect kind of principles that came out of learning the lessons of just observing in Rwanda all of those years ago in Africa when atrocities were occurring, obviously on a grand scale. So I just wanted to bring in that kind of difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking.
Yeah, and my answer would be very simple. In order for you to make peace, the hostile parties have to want to do so. And in this instance, neither Hezbollah or the IDF want to make peace. The IDF clearly thinks now that it can decimate Hezbollah, and I think they may be on to something. I think this is a pivotal moment in the war where Israel is going to expand it, and it remains to be seen what its adversaries are going to do. But so far, it seems like a successful opening gambit. Now, if you can't make peace because the parties involved don't want peace, then you certainly can't enforce peace because they're shooting at each other. You know, they're doing those things. So, but here's where it gets interesting, and here's where my game theoretic logic was going, because in Israel, they have been talking for some time now about this sixth front war, which again is like, seriously? But, and that's why I think at the beginning, and you and I actually talked about this. Okay, what are the fronts that they are going to have to engage? And at that time, we speculated, I think fairly accurately, about 5. And we really didn't consider the Houthis as, you know, a serious rival. But the Israelis do. And so now the Israeli strategists are openly talking about being able to successfully prosecute a sixth front war because they believe they've intimidated both the Houthis and the Iranians, and then they can deal directly on the ground with anything in their vicinity, including Syria. Now, we'll come back to Syria in a second, but that's maybe wishful thinking. You know, I think, normally military planners don't want to overestimate their capabilities.
No, and I would note too, you know, that while nothing came out of this, there was the bilateral meeting between the new leader of Iran and Russian Federation leader Vladimir Putin last week. Now, on that, remember that Iran and Russia have an uneasy alliance here. Either party doesn't entirely trust the other. And there's been a transactional type of arrangement that has been going on where the Russian Federation requires Iranian missiles to continue to supply its ability to attack Ukraine. What has, in transactional affairs like that, what has Iran got out of that? That is a question mark there. And I would suggest that that's a very, very concerning thing should the Middle East blow up like where it is heading now, beyond what we would have thought 6 months ago. And if it continues on this trajectory, I would be watching very carefully the transactional arrangements between what are global powers now, irrespective of what Joe Biden and Barack Obama referred to with the Russian Federation throughout their tendencies in the White House, that it was a regional power at best. We are looking at something quite different here, particularly when these types of entities start to present themselves on the global stage with overt bilateral meetings that leaves question marks around such things. In a way, that's a deterrence in its own respect in some sane strategic thinking sectors of the world. So I just wanted to bring that in too, Paul. That's an event, and it may or may not have influence right here and now with respect to where Israel is. But once again, we get back on every issue of this to what are the medium and long-term strategic positions that all players, including Israel and those aspiring for statehood in the region, have.
Yeah, and actually, it's a good introduction to my very brief comments about the use of game theory, or how to see this in game theoretic terms. Very simply, game theory is used by strategists to simplify the exchanges between opponents. So tit for tat, people have heard these phrases before. And there are two types of games. There's what is known, and we'll just assume for the sake of argument that these are two-actor games. I mean, there's multiple actor games. Economists have run with this stuff. But to make it simple, which military strategists try to do, and as someone knows, I was part of a net assessment group where we gamed out every month regional scenarios back in the days when I was in the office of the Secretary of Defense. The issue is this. There are iterative games, which are games where the outcome is always the same. That is, there's an exchange and the outcome is whatever it is. Another exchange, the outcome is the same, so on and so forth. What happens then is either the actors stop playing or they accept that status quo. I would argue that before October 7th last year, Israel and its regional adversaries, Hezbollah and Hamas, and to some extent Iran, were in an iterative game. There'd be occasional exchanges of fire, there would be occasional raids, but the status quo stayed more or less the same. October 7th changed that, and that became what is known as an extensive form game. The outcomes change with each iteration, with each exchange. This is far more unstable. This is far more uncertain, and I think this is where we are. That Israel, based on its exchanges with Hamas, now with Hezbollah, with Iran directly, I mean, it's killing people on Iranian territory, now taking on the Houthis, I think they seriously believe that this extensive form game is flowing in their favor. Again, they may be miscalculating, but also, if I think about it in game theoretic terms, the one thing that many strategists do that they shouldn't do, which is they're thinking only about their side and about predictable responses. And you just mentioned an unpredictable response. Putin went down to Iran, flew in contested airspace, went to Iran, and something has happened. I think that he may be offering security guarantees to the Iranians. I'm not saying nuclear umbrella stuff, but say if you are attacked directly by Israel or the United States in concert with Israel, we will do something in
And
your
remember
defense.
that the Russian Federation has an arrangement in counterpart to NATO arrangement that if a strike occurs on a member state of that arrangement, that security alliance, then it is an attack on all. And it may be that negotiations are occurring in that space, but this is supposition. But the question mark is what's important here, isn't it, Paul? Because that question is significant in this.
Oh, it is. And just like the United States has to show that it's a firm ally of Israel, and NATO may have to start showing a little more commitment to Ukraine, the Russians have to do a similar thing for Iran. They have defense and security agreements with Iran. And what we've heard in the last week is there are now credible reports that there are North Korean troops fighting with the Russians in eastern Ukraine. There's even some reported deaths of North Korean troops. If that's true, this thing's going to ramp up in a hurry because now you've got an extra regional actor coming in, and it's not former Soviet Union stuff. It's not like it's Chechens and whatnot. These are North Koreans, and we know that there's been a series of high-level meetings between Putin and Kim Jong-un. I have a strong feeling that they too have extended a security alliance. They had one previously, but they've deepened it, and now they got troops on the ground, if the reports are true, in eastern Ukraine. And Russia's showing its gratitude by helping out some of the other, what was it Bush called them, the axis of evil. My point here is simply that this is now starting to flow in unanticipated directions. And these directions may not be beneficial over the short term, much less the medium term, for Israel and the United States. So the question now is, will Israel secure its strategic objectives in southern Lebanon before November 5th? And there will be then that new status quo, which again, how long they plan to occupy southern Lebanon would depend on how much they have decimated Hezbollah and the strength of the Iranian response, and we simply don't know this at this point.
So we've got 3 weeks basically. So what's the answer to that, and what does it look like if it does or it doesn't achieve that particular goal?
Well, I think if I want to bring out my crystal ball, I think that Israel is going to prevail in over the next 3 weeks. Because let's be honest, what is the international community doing to stop this? Lebanon is ostensibly a neutral state. Right, nothing. Yeah. Now, I will say this. Here's another part of Netanyahu's calculation. Lebanon is not unified behind Hezbollah at all. Hezbollah represents a certain sector of the Shia population of Lebanon. But Lebanon has Christians, Lebanon has Druze, Lebanon has Sunni Muslims. Lebanon is a heterogeneous polyglot of cultures and whatnot. And I think the Israelis have their hooks into certain segments of the Druze and the Christians in particular. Remember, Ariel Sharon was the butcher of Shatila. And the butchering was committed by Druze militias against Shia Muslims. And so I think that Netanyahu may be banking on some sort of uprising against Hezbollah once he's broken them down.
And Paul, you and I would remember the 1980s where Beirut in Lebanon was sectarian, it was chaos. It was such a destroyed state after what it had once been, like the envy, Beirut in particular. The envy of the world. So it is almost as if Netanyahu is nostalgically thinking that that's an advantage for Israel. Because if anything, he's stoking the fire of segregation on those grounds of which you have just defined there. But I get back to the point of sustainability. Irrespective of what happens in the United States presidency, there are unknowns wrapped around who will be the successful candidate. Israel is dependent almost solely on the United States agreement to continue to provide it with the means to breach international law and international humanitarian law and international conventions. If the United States on one side, like with Kamala Harris, comes through and says, we're committed to the defense of Israel, but not the disproportionate, unjust and illegal means of which it is trying to establish some sort of statehood of which is going to surround it with chaos and death. And on the other hand, a United States presidency under Trump saying, well, what am I going to get out of this? So we come back to that strategic positions of which they may be staking out the ground. I don't believe that they're going to have any interest in entering into talks after an election is concluded in the United States. But that I don't see any evidence that the kind of ground they're trying to establish is to gain as much ground before they have to talk, like we see in a lot of other conflicts. It's almost as if they're trying to tear down the region so that it can be rebuilt and it be a part of the rebuilding in its own interests. But once again, it comes back to the United States, and I don't see any indications at all that that's a stable footing for Israel to position itself in the medium term. And there's another element that we discussed, Paul, in our emails and correspondence prior to this program, that Israel is so isolated now compared to where it was even 1 year ago, when it was attacked itself. And we must remember that it was. But it is clear it's sought an advantage from that atrocity and has committed multiple atrocities on multiple fronts. Now, we know that, but what is it going to be in the near future when the where the nations of the world that in the past have thought, we don't like what Israel does with the IDF and Mossad around the place, but man, they really have helped us in the telecommunication areas. And I'm thinking Africa here. Even North Korea on the Chinese border, there was a lot of work in the 1990s by Israel with respect to new technologies and legitimate companies establishing it. Even in New Zealand, we see that New Zealand's energy generation goals with respect to our geothermal energy ambitions being sustained and maintained and increased are totally reliant on Israel companies based and headquartered in Tel Aviv for New Zealand to achieve its strategic energy goals in that sector. We see this all over the world. Now, when Israel has become so isolated as it is already, and it continues, it isn't just a consumer boycott that perhaps may worry it with the BDS movement outside, but populations of countries all around the world of which its trade and service and procurement and IP, intellectual property, is reliant upon. And when that window or that curtain of goodwill falls, where is Israel then? It cannot even sustain itself economically without any trade export and service procurement and IP, let alone product. And I see it as a strategically failed state in the future, and particularly because of the decisions that have been made in the short-term strategic arena right now.
Yeah, it could well be. In fact, it brings up something I read last week. It turns out that secular Jews are leaving Israel in very large numbers. And Israel has about 10 million people. Around 5 million of them are the intelligentsia, the scientists, the academics, and what have you. Most of them are secular Jews. And they're leaving because they turn to conservatism in Israel, much like in the States, but in a Jewish form, has brought with some very, very negative social consequences. For example, a lot of the new Russian and American immigrants, Orthodox Jews, coming into the country do not do science or math. It's against their religious beliefs. So you're replacing scientific-minded people with ignorant people, basically, who are very, very religious.
And in many cases, proportionally quite extremist.
Exactly. So this, from a futures perspective, is really bad. Okay, Israel can't retain its competitive edge in high technologies if this continues. Now, I think the calculation behind Netanyahu's gambit vis-a-vis the U.S. elections was both political and technical, and it actually can be expanded to other parts of the Western world. And it works like this. Uh, Technically, the Western intelligence alliances, right? Not just the so-called Five Eyes, not individual, the CIA or MI5, MI6. They all depend on Mossad for real-time Middle Eastern intelligence. Again, Mossad right now is living up to its reputation, both as a intelligence collection agency and then as a hunter-killer agency. Our intelligence agencies here in New Zealand don't have the killer side of things, thankfully, but they do. And so that's part of the dirty secret here is that all of the West, but also countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, they depend on intelligence flows from Mossad to get, track the movements of extremists in Indonesia. I mean, it all starts, if there's something going on in the Middle East, Mossad is providing the information about it. So no one is going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg when it comes to intelligence. And Mossad has been very smart about cornering the market. The Saudis have tried to develop their own intelligence capabilities, but they're not trustworthy. And so there's no rival. I mentioned the Jordanians earlier. Jordanians have a significant intelligence capability, but again, it is, it's a very small presence compared to the capabilities of Mossad. So that's the technical aspect. No Western governments want to interfere with the relationship between their intelligence communities and Israel's intelligence community. And so, as long as that continues, people are just going to be silent about Israel. But the other one.
So we saw that with the where the UK is, Canada, Trudeau's support for Israel was staggering, perhaps more in that vein than what Biden's has been, particularly from what we've seen in Bob Woodward's reportage of late. So I get what you're saying there. It may be a bit of a twist in the tail, though, that these governments that are relying on Israeli intelligence and justify their silence on the basis of that their populations perhaps have other things in mind. And it'll be interesting because in that respect, we're talking medium and long-term term and isolation that is driven from the ground up. And that is something that clearly the Israelis are very sensitive to, even in what we call relative peace times, that any criticisms of the State of Israel's decisions are forcefully responded to, particularly with respect to media, by the various networks inside Western countries. So we know how sensitive Israel is to criticism in those ways, and there's a reason for that. But that's a very strong point. It answers in spades why we see a dithering by way of the leaderships of Western nations, particularly in the Five Eyes nations and their proxies. And it in some ways shows how Israel has the ability to manipulate and exploit that relationship. I wonder how that can be sustained should you have a president that is emerged from a judicial prosecutorial background into a situation where she would be well aware that the world's international legal apparatus is broken. It is not sustaining any elements of what would be progress or peace, and how she would, as a global leader, seek to address that anomaly and to rebuild an apparatus perhaps that would address some of the atrocities and insecurities that are being advanced by states like Israel around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to my second point. The technical one was as I just described, but the other side, running parallel with the technical defense of Israel, if you will, is political, and that is to say that Israel sees the wave of anti-Muslim sentiment that has built up since 9/11. It sees the rise of right-wing extremism, which is Islamophobic as well as anti-Semitic. But mostly it sees that governments in the West, in part aided by the Jewish diaspora around the world, but mostly out of concerns about losing access to Israeli technology, these economic benefits, and what have you, would prefer to simply not talk about it, or if talk about it, do it in very oblique ways. I have no doubts that in diplomatic missions, there are representatives of Western countries who are trying to, give the hard word to the Israelis that they have to stop. I mean, you made a good analogy. October 7th basically is Israel's 9/11. They had a moment where the world, by and large, was with them, and they've squandered it. They've gone way out of proportion. But now I'm starting to think, well, they may not have planned that at the beginning. But once they saw that their enemies are weaker than anticipated, they've decided to go for it. And here's the rub. If Israel succeeds in decimating Hezbollah, if it succeeds in intimidating Iran and wiping Gaza off the face of the earth, I'd hate to say it, but most Western governments will be very thankful. Will be quietly going, yeah, someone did it. And I won't say they will have carte blanche, but a lot of their atrocities, a lot of their very serious misbehavior will be forgiven.
So with that, and I accept your argument there, that speaks a lot about the hypocrisy and also the dangers and insecurities on the global stage that the West advocates for. And that leads into the question, with respect to specifically Hezbollah and Iran, that the missile strikes targeting Israel, is that defensive or offensive with respect to Hezbollah and separately Iran? Because this is significant. I think many have argued that Israel is defending itself against an oppressive attacking threat from that front, meaning Hezbollah in Lebanon, and secondly, Iran across that divide there. But if they have an uneasy, peaceful position with respect to firing, particularly, and I'm talking Iran here, and other times, are we just seeing a retaliatory response from these people at this time where Israel is exploiting that and putting a cloak and a fog of war around it and saying that it's under attack from an attacking force as opposed to a defending force? To boil it all down, I'm just saying it appears to me to be Israel on the offensive and a defensive response in large part with respect to those two fronts there.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that what we have to understand, when I said that the game shifted from an iterative game to an extensive form game, it was Israel that shifted the game. When they saw that to their eyes, Gaza was a success and they had far less losses, they knew they could open another front. And remember, Hezbollah had been lobbing missiles at them. There were regular exchanges. But I think the triggering event was the Hezbollah strike on a playground right outside of the West Bank, in which a bunch of children were killed. As it turns out, none of them were Jewish. It was a Christian enclave right outside of the West Bank that got targeted. I think that was the triggering moment where the Israeli high command said, you know what, we're going to say that we're defending ourselves against these missile strikes. And they're doing it, the Hezbollah is doing it out of solidarity with Hamas, but they shouldn't have any dog in this fight. We were focused on Hamas, not on them. Now they come and pick on us. Let's just take advantage of this and wipe them out. And of course, they knew that. knowing they had the pager bombs in place, how deeply penetrated Hezbollah was by Mossad, and they decided to take advantage of it again with the time constraint of the U.S. elections and all of that. Now, so I agree. Israel has gone on the offensive. They'll keep on yammering about, defending and this, that, and the other, but they're not. They're trying to redraw the map. I mean, quite frankly, that's the ultimate goal, but the map will be in their favor, again, if this works out for them, and that's uncertain. As far as Iran, and Hezbollah now is playing defense. So I see their missiles strikes, which are diminishing because they're getting destroyed. That's a defensive reaction to try to keep the Israelis off guard. But there's Israeli troops in Lebanon. I mean, it's all over, but the shouting. And then Iran's in a quandary, which is why Putin probably went down there, because Iran has to save face and do something for its allies. Iran has not responded to the strikes against the Houthis. It has given a limited response to the strikes against Hezbollah. Their clients are getting clobbered, and they've been very muted, as I said earlier in the show. And so I think what they're doing is trying to save face, and so their reaction is defensive as well. Now, this doesn't mean that with a security guarantee from Russia that's been, doubled up by Putin's visit, that they won't start taking offensive operations. And of course, we have to remember about shadow wars, gray zone phenomena. Not everything is black and white. You don't have to just do missile strikes, as Iran is really, well knows. But they have the ability to reach out and touch people in untoward places. So I think for now, they have to do these public displays to reassure their clients, also reassure the Shia Muslim populations of the Middle East that they have their backs. This is a big game. It's a cultural game.
And it speaks to the global South. It is particularly
Very
the global that is aware that the hypocrisy on one side of the bipolar arrangement in the world at the moment is with the West, that certainly there with the authoritarian states too, but there's a battle for the will of the global South, and you can see that moving very, very significantly within the African states. That's why I mentioned African Americans as voter bloc earlier on this particular issue, which hasn't really been adequately assessed and analysed at this juncture. But that is a message if you look at where those signals, the optics of all of this were labelled. And if those authoritarian states like Iran and with the, at least by way of association, the Russian Federation, can elevate an awareness within the global South of how rogue Israel has become and how it has been appeased and even now defended with a commitment of boots on the ground in Israel's territory, then that's an advantage for those authoritarian states when you look at it from a bipolarity point of view. We did a specific episodes on all of this, didn't we, Paul? And we're seeing it tragically mapping out in this way as we speak. So I just wanted to, once again, just edge that part of our narrative in that direction and put it back to you. And thank you for kind of raising that element too. It's really important, I believe.
Yeah, I think that the rise of the global South, symbolized by the expansion of the BRIC network of countries, as both an economic and perhaps a military actor down the road, is the broader context that all actors are looking at. And in that event, I would say that the global South is far more influential in determining the medium to long-term outcome of this particular conflict than many people give it credit for. I think, the way India, for example,
Yeah.
sees this conflict going down the road. The fact that the BRICS have expanded to include Sunni Arab countries, and but also the originals, countries like Argentina may or may not go in, all
Mm.
indicates that there is a geopolitical shift around the
And
world.
I would add into that the Republic of Turkey, very
Yeah,
significant entity. We saw how significant Turkey was in the 2000s through to 2005, perhaps, with respect to Iraq and Iran, in trying to make sure that while its air bases were used to strike targets inside Iraq by United States military, to try and ensure that it didn't escalate amongst others within the region like Iran, etc., etc. So I see Turkey's position here with an authoritarian leader actually having a significant play in where we are right now with respect to global south and its positioning of influence. How that affects other conflicts is for another program. But I agree, Paul. I think that there is much to this, and perhaps that element creates more of a quandary for Israel's strategic interest in the medium term than what perhaps its own tactical advisors are appreciating.
yeah. I mean, I think that the U.S. paralysis when it comes to trying to modify Israel's behavior one way or another uh, has created space for the likes of Erdogan to emerge as potential peace brokers. He can straddle east and west. He has good relations with the Russians, good relations with the Chinese. I mean, that's the way these actors think. They go, "Oh, I can position myself here. I can take advantage of this moment, and I will be able to get concessions that I want in exchange for facilitating some other group's ambitions, whatever they
And
may
if
be."
and if you're a victim, a civilian that is lying there bleeding and seeing that your family is no longer with you, that they're bled out, they're dead amongst the carnage, it doesn't matter who's putting their hand out to help you get up or to
No,
address
true.
this issue. And I think, what is it, that old song about, such things. It's lost on my memory now. I'm starting to wade into the peacenik areas of past, but it captures into the essence of some real realities here. That when we look at such conflicts, we often look at it from the top down, but the impact and the atrocity, the injustices, the breaches of law are in evidence from the ground up. And that's something I think that these authoritarian states and those like Modi's India, those of Erdogan's Turkey, and those can think to themselves, we may have self-interest, just like the Western leading nations have had self-interest in the past of being peace brokers. But at the end of the day, we've brought in some very, very strategic elements to our position on that. It includes, ironically, an advancement on human rights principles. And that's something that I think very quickly the West has been flayed bare by Israel to show just how deep those hypocrisies and self-interests actually elevate and advance the atrocities that are occurring in breach of international law in this conflict. But where do we go from here, Paul? That's the biggest, widest open question that I'd probably have ever put to you, because it's completely generalised on purpose to allow you to be able to prioritise what should happen, what can happen, and what impact that has.
Well, there. Let me phrase it this way. I think that the again the most decisive moment is going to be the outcome of the U.S. election. Because that will determine the course of the United States and its relationship with Israel. Now, I do want to say something about self-interest in international relations. You, of course, well know, and the audience probably knows, that I'm a realist, trained as a realist. So countries have interests, they don't have friends. Um, Friends are changeable depending on the interest. Self interest is the ultimate cause of why international institutions fail. Countries see that their self interest is best served by not adhering to international norms, by not supporting the prosecution of, let's say, Netanyahu or Putin by the International Criminal Court.
Mm.
And let me use an example to show how staggering this is. New Zealand champions itself as a leader of the rules based order with its so called independent foreign policy. And yet, in the face of what Israel is doing, it has remained not only largely silent, even though there are regular public demonstrations in New Zealand against the war and pro Palestine. Not only that, but New Zealand, and it goes to the technical argument I made earlier about Mossad. New Zealand has a small but very vigorous defense technology sector. One of the biggest clients of New Zealand defense firms, high tech firms, is Israel. There was a scandal in the mid 2000s when it came out that we were sending guidance systems to Israel so they could put them in their Sidewinder missiles or air to ground missiles. We're playing a part. Okay, that didn't
And
go away.
I tip my hat to the work of Hamid Sudan in this area.
Yeah. He in particular, for those who don't know, he was an employee at the company that I shall not mention. Saw that stuff was getting sent to Israel. Again, guidance systems for missiles and artillery shells, I believe. And he did a whistleblower, and and suffered.
Followed up by actually entering into the occupied territories that Israel was commanding at that particular time, and they very quickly put him on a plane and dumped him in Burkina Faso for his efforts. But there's a bit of courageousness there on behalf of Hamid, and it elevated it into the public mind here in New Zealand, just what was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, and it illustrates what I'm getting to, which is New Zealand, which crows a lot about its independence and talks about the rules-based order. We've already said we're not independent, and we obey the rules that suit us. If we really believed in international norms, we wouldn't be trading with China because of the treatment of the Uyghurs and their own workers, for that matter, because we supposedly.
Or the United States when it was invading Iraq. So, I'm just kind of always giving a counterbalance to such things.
Yeah, no, very good. Very good. So I think self-interest, this is why realism is such a good school of thought for international relations. It would be great if we could all have a group hug and total respect to people like Hamid, who are pacifists, are idealists. Good on them. And may their efforts succeed. They won't happen in my lifetime, but I'm a very pragmatic person, by both personality and training. And I think, okay, the reason Israel's getting away with this is because a lot of people in the West don't like Hamas, don't like Hezbollah, don't like Iran because they're too quote unquote extremists. And so they wouldn't mind seeing them get wiped out. But more importantly, their self-interest dictates that you don't step too heavily on Israel's toes. Because again, it's like, it's become a global tail that wags the dog, or a tail that wags the global dog, at least in Western capitals. And that, until that issue is resolved, this conflict is going to continue and probably expand some more, depending on what the Russians do once the Iranians figure out their response.
Yeah. With respect to that, I come back to the point that the current status quo with respect to Israel's relationships with the United States and its other partners. It cannot be sustained in these ways. It just simply will not sustain itself in the medium term. That the forces of isolation around it are not just from peacenik areas, but even those that have self-interest in their body politic domestically appear to be under strain to the point where what should be a fairly clear and decisive and impressive win by way of the Democrats could actually be lost, the presidency lost, on the basis of this conflict. And that's a realism, that's a reality. Yep, subjective, and I know we can go down those things relating to really, where things are with respect to the various groups and sections of voting public in the United States. But there's a reality around that.
No, there is. But look
a convicted felon could get into the White House on the basis of those that choose not to vote because of the United States' involvement in what is a breach of international law and atrocity in the Middle East.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Fair enough. Let me do you a sort of big and small thing to show you, again, self-interest and Israel's defenders. We've heard very little from this government about the conflict other than to basically side with Israel and call for ceasefires. Their calls should be a lot stronger, but when they do make pronouncements, it tends to favor Israel. Now, in the opposition, a member of the Labor Party, a former minister, tweeted or retweeted a pro-Palestinian comment. And the comment was something along the lines of the war with Hamas did not start on October 7th. There's a lot of history that went into that day. Okay, so to my mind, fair enough, right? Fair enough. This has been going on for a long time. Seems sort of commonsensical. Well, that guy got pilloried by the current government. The right-wingers came out, oh, you're anti-Semitic. They just lambasted him. He was nothing of the sort. He took down the tweet and then went into hiding because the Labor Party clearly thought he was hurting it by coming out with his public pronouncement. Again, it was sort of common sense. What, you think the war started on October 7th, 2023? Ask any Palestinian. So there's that. Now, that's the small. That's why I like to use this in political science, a lot of the social sciences, use small case studies like New Zealand to speak to larger truths. And so there's an example of where, even here, you can't say an obvious fact and not get pilloried by the conservative elements in our political society. Now, the U.S., it's different in the sense that what will happen to Israel after November 5th is contingent on the margin of victory for whoever wins. Now, I've already said publicly, I don't think the polls are truthful. I think that Trump is going to lose by 5 to 10 percentage points. If you notice at his rallies, in his interviews, he's not talking a lot about foreign affairs. He's actually just blathering. And again, talking about, people eating dogs and cats and all this ridiculous stuff. Talks a lot about himself and his grievances about this, that, and the other. So he's no longer really hitting the policy points. And I think that's going to come back and bite him. Because, again, he's showing what he truly is. Now, if he wins, as I said before, it's carte blanche for Israel. And that's trouble for the rest of us. But if Harris wins by 5 to 10, I won't say that she has a mandate, but she has how could we call it, a nudge for change. That she will be able to say, okay, I won by more than Biden won in 2020. Clearly, at least the left-leaning side of the American electorate wants change. And one area where they want to change is in the relationship with Israel. It doesn't mean that the United States will abandon Israel. But let's put it this way. The U.S. is a very strong economic and military partner of Australia, of Germany. If Germany or Australia conducted a war the way the Israelis did, in the measure that they have, I think U.S. policy would change towards those countries as a punitive sanction and say, will you knock it off? It's gone way beyond the scope of the atrocities committed against you. Way beyond. And this redrawing the map effort, no, we've tried that. The U.S. is the ultimate imperialist country. We've tried redrawing the map. And guess what? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. You can have all the military might, but if what you're confronting is an idea, if what you're confronting is an ideology, you can slaughter as many people as you want, and their heirs will come back to fight you. So unless you're going to do a complete genocide, which is impossible to do, although you look like you're trying it, you got to find a peaceful solution to this mess. And that, I think, if she wins 5-10, we will see change in the U.S. relationship. And let's be very clear. I mean, you and I know this well, but the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States is not monolithic. It's extremely heterogeneous. In fact, here in New Zealand, our Jewish community is quite divided. You hear from the Zionists a lot, but you don't hear from the left-leaning union members and those sort of folk.
Yeah, exactly. And that is what gives hope for the future. And then it's also a demonstration that those anti-Semitic tropes aren't a reality. And you know, I'm sure the audience understands what I'm talking about there. But yeah, and at this point, Paul, and thank you for that. Let's bring in some of the comments that have been made over the course of the program. I've highlighted a number, and then we and you in particular can choose which ones you would wish to respond to. And I'll read them out for those that are listening and not just watching. So starting off with Stephen Lennon, who made the comment, and I'll bring it up on screen for those that are watching as well. And Stephen Lennon says, Hezbollah get most of their weapons from Syria. That was attacked on multiple fronts from NATO nations and Sunni Arab state. Bashar al-Assad asked for help from Russia and Iran. So he's giving a bit of a view there, and that's one that I think I am not in a position to fact check on at this stage. But Paul, you may be able to.
Yeah, we have to go back to the era of the military nationalists in the Middle East. Nasser, al-Assad's father, the king of Jordan's father, I forget his exact name. There was an era of military nationalists, and they were feared by the West because there was concerns that they would expropriate oil reserves. See, in those days, big foreign firms still basically controlled the ground. I mean, there wasn't just political authority at play there. And those military nationalist regimes, the whole northern tier of Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, as well as Egypt, all sought help from the Soviet Union. And they received it. They received it willingly, as did Iraq. Again, Saddam Hussein was a military nationalist to begin with.
And this got to a point, wasn't it, with Jimmy Carter's efforts at Camp David, where this was addressed, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he was trying, to broker a peace. But I think the important thing about Syria, anyway, is that the Alawite regime in Syria, which is led by al-Assad, is a Shiite minority regime in an otherwise Sunni country propped up by Iran. And then the Russians have gotten involved and what have you. That's a geopolitical fault line that goes back to the 1950s and 60s. And the West has not been able to shake that alliance because, in large measure, the Soviets made better allies than Western counterparts did, and the Russians make better allies than the United States and other Western countries do, because they don't impose human rights conditions, they don't ask for democracy. They have their interests. And there's, for example, a Russian naval base in the port of Tartus in Syria. So and that's their interest. That they have a port on the Eastern Mediterranean that gets them out of the Black Sea and out into open ocean, which is the Russians have always felt hemmed in when it comes to their Western fleets, because they're either ice locked half the year or it's the Black Sea or Sea of Azov. Only the Pacific allows them direct access to serious blue water. And so that relationship is a long-standing one. Unfortunately, I think Obama made a mistake, and he said he was going to draw a line in the sand and what have you, rather than approach the Russians and say, look at it, he's your guy, and this is sort of getting out of hand. We got to fight ISIS, but now, ISIS wants to, overthrow, undermine the al-Assad regime. How about, we focus on ISIS, you focus on defending the Alawite regime, and we won't interfere with that. We'll let you do your thing, we'll do our thing, we'll coordinate so that we're not shooting at each other, and Assad gets to say. They didn't do that. They thought they could remove Assad by force. That turned out to be wishful thinking. And so Syria now is a staging ground for arms shipments to Hezbollah, arms shipments to Hamas. And that's why it may become the sixth front in Israel's strategic warfare planning, because they've already struck Syria several times trying to kill off Revolutionary Guard commanders. So they know they're there. They know the Iranians are in Syria in a fairly significant way. And they're willing, the Israelis are willing to take the war to them. But then that gets the bigger players involved. And that's perhaps why the U.S. has that Ranger battalion sitting somewhere there as sort of a deterrent to
a
further
reminder, at least.
Yeah, but that, again, bringing in now 1,000 Rangers to confront whatever contingency, that's escalation. I mean, there's no other way around it. Now you're making things worse. So, it may come to that. It may not. Maybe the presence of these people will make a difference in the strategic calculations of Israel's adversaries, but it might only, embolden Israel to continue to prosecute this multi-front war in ways that it wouldn't have if the U.S. hadn't given it this very extensive security guarantee. So again, I guess I keep on falling back on everybody's waiting for that November 5th election. I see nothing but bad news if Trump wins, but he's behaving in a cretinous way at this point. And I noticed there was a comment about, Trump is anti-war. Come on. Come on.
And I myself was just going to address that. This is from Paul Buchanan, and he says Trump is anti-war, so what's your agenda? And I think with respect to Trump, we do know he's transactional, and it comes down to that. Paul and I discussed this earlier. So what does Trump personally get out of all of this? And the answers to the whole future with respect to a Trump-led United States and Israel's position in the Middle East, they hinge on that, on a transaction. And it might be that Israel has nothing to offer but chaos, but that's yet to be seen. And also, as like Paul has pointed out, the elections really determine so much in this. So that's that one. There's a couple of other things. Frederick Miles, he put the comment in here, Israel and Ukraine have gone too far. And this is interesting. This is why I read this one out. and that Frederick Miles is looking at it obviously from a point of view of conflict as opposed to alliances. And that I think, excuse me, brings it back to a reality outside of the conflicting interests of geopolitics. So I'm just noting that. He goes on to say other things too. But also, if we go back to Stephen Lennon, and his comment here that I'm going to read out came from the discussions that Paul and I were doing with respect to that question. Is Israel under attack from an forcing aggression, an aggressing position from Hezbollah and or Iran, or are they acting in this context at this time in a defensive move, which renders Israel's argument ridiculous, if that's the case? And that's why those questions were put in there for Paul and I to have a talk about that. So Stephen Lennon's response to that was, Iran has been attacked by Israel for far too long. Remembering the attack on the Iranian embassy, killing Hamas leader who was negotiating in Iran, and also the killing of one of its commanders when Israel struck to take out Nasrallah in Beirut. Now, that's the kind of debate I would be presumptuous to say starts to unpick some of the positions that may be relevant in the near future. But once again, like Paul has said, only after it's clear what the United States governance at the administrative level at the White House, once that is clear. So these are really good debates, I think, Paul, that are starting to rise up from this. And there are many other questions and comments that have been put there too. But generally, I think they're coming up from, once again, Stephen Lennon. The last comment that has come in, I'll bring it on screen, is now once again talking about, the military capabilities. And when we see alliances perhaps starting to burgeon between the Russian Federation and Iran, it is relevant. He says anyway, he says here, Iran is a military superpower. Its missile strike on Israel is a game changer, overwhelming their defence capability, reaching the apartheid state, travelling at 1,100 miles per hour within 10 minutes. Yep. Many would come to say that we must be reminded too that Israel is a nuclear state, and also has the ability, like we saw all those years ago, that Stuxnet was able to disrupt the nuclear generation energy plants inside of Iran at will, and that's something that is perhaps the detail of for another program. So, Paul, with respect to all of this, where do you think the priorities of exiting out of this at this time, and where are we going to land with this program? So many leads.
Yeah, well, I was going to say to Frederick's comment about the Ukraine and Israel, he's right. But what's happened is, most military commanders and strategists, they want their wars to be short and sharp. So you bring your military advantages to bear hard on the enemy and break the enemy's will, and then get them to concede whatever it is you want. In these cases, and these are amalgams now, they're mixtures of guerrilla war with conventional war, but the threat of nuclear war turns everything into a war of attrition. And by nature, wars of attrition are extensive. Okay, they go on for a long time until someone runs out, literally, of willpower or materiel. And so that's what we're seeing here. In the Ukraine, in a very classic sense, the Russians are just grinding the Ukrainians down. And because NATO doesn't have the will as of yet to involve itself, the Russians are making gains now. Ukraine doesn't have the manpower to keep up. I think it may be a strategic miscalculation if they're putting North Koreans into the Russian war effort, because that could be the justification for NATO to get involved in Ukraine. Again, you've got extra regional types. We shall see. In the case of Israel, they appear to think that they can grind everybody down. I disagree with Stephen. Iran is a middle power. Much like Russia, it is bigger militarily than it is economically or diplomatically. And, as a result, its foreign policy is disproportionately based, weirdly enough, much like in the US, on military power rather than on diplomacy and those sort of things.
And you would know from your political science studies and backgrounds and expertise, perhaps there's something in it that it is within its recent generational post-revolution. And so that there may be elements of that in there. It's an interesting little political science element, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a very odd interview that I saw yesterday. I think it was with the BBC. Their reporter went out on the streets of Tehran and asked people who they supported in the U.S. election. And let's say they surveyed a dozen people or so. Let's say a dozen just for the sake of commentary. 10 out of 12 said they preferred Donald Trump.
Wow.
I mean, it was, and they said, oh, you see a guy, it was sort of the MAGA rhetoric, he's a guy who delivers. One guy who what might have been an academic, for all I know, his English was very good. And he said, well, even though Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal was not good for the U.S. and its allies. So, it's like, whoa, this guy might know something from the inside, and thought it was good for the Yanks to pull out and maybe renegotiate another one with a more reasonable group of people. The point, I think, is that we're all, we're sitting on the head of a pin, and that we're waiting to see if there'll be a political change and in the United States. And here's the thing, although certain minority communities, let's say Muslim Americans, do spend a lot of time thinking about foreign policy, and particularly the policy vis-a-vis Israel, the majority of Americans see foreign policy as a relatively low priority. And because of that, and I think in part, as you mentioned, Trump being transactional, he's not anti-war. I agree with him in that the U.S. Attempts to use its military to bring, quote unquote, democracy to countries that have no history with democracy, let's say Iraq, was an utter and abject failure. I'll give him that. But you're absolutely right, Selwyn, in that Trump has repeatedly threatened to nuke people. You may remember some bad jokes he made at the UN about North Korea before he started hugging, Kim Jong-un. He's waved the sword from time to time. He's no peacenik. And as you very, very accurately said, it's all about what's in it for him. If he thinks that starting a war, let's say with Venezuela, because the Venezuelans supposedly are sending their criminal aliens, again, another American phrase, to the United States, he'll do it. He'll do it. It's simply not, he doesn't understand the complexities of foreign relations, much less warfare. He says he's smarter than all the generals, and then he says that we could use a nuclear weapon to stop a hurricane. I mean, I guess that's why. I mean, we've gone into circus territory there. But my point being is that we get the U.S. elections out of the way. If he wins, the goddess save us all. If she wins, then it's time for change. And they're not going to abandon Israel, as I said before, but it's time to hold them to account. And at that point, I would be laying groundwork now, if I was in the Harris team, with the UN, with European interlocutors,
So at
and say,
least
look,
there are signals there in the
yeah,
forward stepping toward the election. I would say too that there's something here for that we may see in the future, that the United States' relationship with Israel is based on Israel's defense, and that may not be on Israel's aggression. And perhaps the latter will be contained and conditioned on the basis of justice. But that's the idealism that lives within people from small states like where I have grown up. And this is where these conversations are fascinating from the point of view of where Paul and I bring it. But Paul, let's end on that.
yeah,
And we really look forward to these conversations continuing on, and whatever forums the people that have been a part of this live audience take part in. But once again, Paul and I would just like to thank you all for taking part once again in the live recording of this episode, and also for those of you that are listening to it on demand. We really appreciate that time investment that you're taking in listening to our evaluations and assessments and analysis on these very, very big issues, but also from the point of view of clearly your own interests here, and spending that time with us on this. I look forward to the next episode that Paul and I will bring, and probably in about 2 weeks' time. We're a bit liberal on that, but that's our intention. And we will certainly once again bring issues that are worthy of discussion on the global stage to you. And we would be getting, by the look of the date there, Paul, this is currently October 14, we'll be getting very close to the United States elections. So who knows what we'll be picking up as a part of our topic at that point. Until then, ka kite anō, take care out there, and please be safe, and let perhaps the rights of individuals and their right to actually live become the norm once again in these regions in the terms ahead of us, one would hope. Goodbye.